"You don't belong here. You people know where your seats are. Go sit in the back." The words landed like a slap across the aisle. Every head turned. The cabin of Flight 728, bound from Chicago to Washington, D.C., had just shifted from quiet boarding hum to ice-cold silence. Amanda Pierce, the flight's lead attendant, stood with her hand on her hip and her voice sharp enough to slice through skin. Her eyes were fixed on a boy, maybe 11, maybe 12, standing in front of seat 2B in the first-class cabin, backpack still slung over one shoulder, ticket in hand. He didn't flinch, not at first, but his smile disappeared. His eyes searched hers for any trace of decency. There was none. Around him, the leather seats gleamed, the passengers shifted, and the silence grew thicker. One woman in 2A raised her eyebrows. A man across the aisle folded his arms and smirked. No one said a word. Not yet. That moment, that ugly, brutal moment, was just the beginning of a flight no one would ever forget. Before we dive into this story of dignity and quiet strength, where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. And if this story moves you, even a little, tap like and subscribe. These stories matter. Now, let's begin. Elijah Thomas had never flown first class before. In fact, he'd never flown alone before. But this trip was special. A scholarship from the National Youth Science Foundation had flown him to Chicago for a 3-day STEM Leadership Summit. He was one of just 15 students chosen from across the country. And now, thanks to a last-minute airline upgrade for student winners, he was seated up front, next to the window, seat 2B. He had rehearsed this moment in his head, how to walk in confidently, how to store his backpack, how to sit without drawing attention. He didn't expect applause or warm smiles, just courtesy, basic kindness. But what greeted him instead was hostility, dressed in a navy blazer and a flight attendant badge. Amanda Pierce had worked for the airline for 12 years. She knew the flight manifest by heart, or so she thought. The moment Elijah stepped into the first-class cabin, something about him, or rather, what he looked like, didn't sit right with her. He wasn't wearing designer clothes. His backpack was worn, the zipper slightly torn. His shoes were polished but modest. His skin was brown. She didn't even ask for his boarding pass at first. She just told him to turn around. When he held out his ticket, neatly folded, she snatched it, scanned it like she was waiting for it to prove her point, then hissed those words, "You don't belong here." Elijah's hand shook just a little as he reached up to place his bag in the overhead bin. His eyes didn't meet hers. He said nothing. Not because he was ashamed, but because his mother had taught him that when people try to drag you down, you don't let them bring your spirit with them. Still, the sting was there, deep and raw. He sat down in 2B, quietly, hands in his lap. The woman in 2A beside him, tall, older, and dressed in pearls, gave him a side glance but said nothing. Across the aisle, a man in a gray blazer leaned to his wife and muttered, "Didn't know they let kids back up here." The curtain between first class and economy hadn't even been closed yet, and already, the air felt different, tense, cold, like Elijah had somehow ruined the comfort of luxury just by breathing in it. A few rows back, a young girl, Ava, about 11, maybe younger, peeked around her seat and looked at Elijah. Her mother pulled her back gently. Ava had seen it all, and unlike the adults around her, her eyes didn't judge. They questioned, quietly. Captain Richard Cole, a seasoned pilot with decades of experience, sat inside the cockpit, unaware of what had just happened in his cabin. Flight 728 wasn't even off the ground. The boarding doors were still open, but the damage had already been done. Elijah pulled out his notebook, a soft, leather-bound journal his mom had given him, and flipped to the section where he'd written down notes from the summit. emergency response protocols, anatomy charts, airway procedures. His mother was a critical care nurse, and she had taught him what to do if someone stopped breathing, if someone collapsed, if help didn't arrive fast enough. It wasn't just science to Elijah, it was instinct. It was preparation for a world that sometimes forgot to protect kids like him. But none of that mattered now. Not to Amanda. Not to the people staring at him like a mistake in a clean room. He was the wrong piece in their puzzle, and he knew it. But he wasn't going to move. He wouldn't shrink. 2 rows back, Marcus King, a civil rights attorney in his mid-40s, watched the scene unfold. He had seen this kind of thing too many times, usually in court, sometimes in line at grocery stores. Now it was unfolding at 3,000 feet before takeoff. He made a mental note but said nothing yet. He wanted to see what kind of young man this was. The plane filled quickly. Bags were stowed. Seat belts clicked. Amanda gave the pre-flight announcements with her usual polished tone, never once glancing back at 2B. As she passed by to check latches and trays, she skipped over Elijah like he didn't exist. And yet, he sat still, calm, focused, dignified in a way that had nothing to do with class and everything to do with character. He didn't know that in just a few minutes. Someone 3 seats away would stop breathing. He didn't know that the same people who looked at him with suspicion would soon be looking to him for help. And he didn't know that the very moment meant to humiliate him, to remind him that he didn't belong, would become the moment that showed everyone else exactly who he was. Because Elijah didn't need a uniform, a title, or approval. He just needed a chance. And that chance was coming faster than anyone could have imagined. The plane had been in the air less than 15 minutes. But to Elijah, it already felt like he'd been holding his breath for hours. He sat in seat 2B, hands folded in his lap, eyes forward, back perfectly straight. Not because he wanted to impress anyone, but because the way people were looking at him made it feel like one wrong move would confirm all their assumptions. He didn't slump. He didn't shift. He barely blinked. That's what happens when you're taught to stay composed. Not just polite. In the face of being unwelcome, he wasn't new to this kind of thing. He just hadn't expected to find it at 3,000 feet, wrapped in leather seats and complimentary drinks. Amanda Pierce, the flight attendant who'd dressed him down before takeoff, hadn't said a word to him since, not when offering water, not when she passed out snacks, not even a glance. As far as she was concerned, he wasn't there. And the rest of the cabin followed her lead, silent, watchful, polite in that sharp, distant way that made it clear this wasn't his space. Next to him, in seat 2A, sat Susan Whitmore, 67 years old, silver hair curled just so, gold earrings, and a crossword puzzle in her lap. She hadn't spoken to Elijah since boarding, just glanced at him, adjusted her purse, and scooted half an inch away, as if proximity might smudge the fabric of her expectations. Her husband, Daniel, sat in 2C on the opposite side of the aisle, a tall, stern man with a deep voice and slower breath than he used to have. They were en route to D.C. for a medical consultation, though no one in the cabin knew that. Susan was recovering from pneumonia, and though cleared to fly, her lungs hadn't fully forgiven her for the infection. That detail would matter. Soon. 2 rows behind Elijah sat Ava Lopez, an 11-year-old girl traveling with her mom for a family reunion in Virginia. Ava had noticed everything. The way the flight attendant's voice got cold the second Elijah stepped into the cabin. The way people looked at him like he'd done something wrong just by sitting down. She watched him quietly. He looked like her cousin Mateo, smart, serious, always drawing robots in his notebook. When Amanda passed their row with the drink cart, Ava leaned forward just slightly and whispered, "You okay?" Elijah gave her a small nod, just enough to say thank you without inviting more. He'd learned that trick early. Speak when spoken to. But don't open doors. People are already trying to close. As the plane leveled out, Elijah pulled out his notebook. Not a tablet or a phone, an actual notebook with graph paper and diagrams in pencil. He flipped to a page labeled Emergency Response, Hypoxia and Breathing Complications. He wasn't reviewing for fun. It was instinct. This was what he turned to when things got heavy. Science, systems, preparation. His mother, a trauma nurse in Southside Chicago, had drilled these basics into him since he was 8. Not because she expected him to become a doctor, but because she knew that. Sometimes, in this world, black children had to be twice as prepared just to be considered human. He remembered how she used to say it while tying his tie for school. Baby, there will be rooms you walk into that weren't built for you. Don't get small. Know your stuff. Keep your head high. And let them catch up. The problem was, most people never caught up. They didn't even try. Up in the cockpit, Captain Richard Cole reviewed weather updates. Mild turbulence ahead. Nothing unusual. He and First Officer Nguyen had flown this route 100 times. They had no idea what was happening back in Row 2. No report had been filed, no conflict documented, because humiliation, the quiet kind, doesn't make noise on flight logs. Meanwhile, in the cabin, Amanda was busy pouring coffee for seat 1A, a business executive tapping away on a laptop. She didn't notice that Susan Whitmore had stopped writing in her crossword puzzle. Didn't notice the shortness in her breath or the way she gripped the armrest as if her fingers couldn't quite keep hold of the present moment. Elijah noticed. Out of the corner of his eye. He caught it. The subtle rise and fall of someone struggling just to stay upright. He turned to her gently. "Ma'am, are you feeling okay?" Susan blinked, caught off guard. Her lips parted like she was going to respond. But no sound came out, just a sharp, dry cough. Then another. She waved her hand dismissively and looked away, embarrassed. "I'm fine," she managed. "Just a tickle." But Elijah had seen that kind of cough before, the kind that doesn't ask permission before it turns into something worse. His mother used to come home with stories, not just about patients, but about moments. How 1 second, someone looked fine, and the next, they were blue at the lips, eyes wide, gasping. It always happened fast. People always ignored the first signs. He reached down and unzipped his backpack quietly, pulling out a travel-sized medical reference book, the same one his mom used to teach him CPR and basic triage. He didn't want to panic anyone, but he needed to be ready. Amanda passed by again, offering drinks to the next row. She still didn't look at him, still skipped over 2B entirely. "Miss?" Elijah said quietly, holding up his hand. She froze, then slowly turned back. "Yes?" she asked, eyes tight. "I think the woman next to me is having trouble breathing." Amanda gave a tight-lipped smile and leaned toward Susan. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" Susan nodded, waving her hand again. "Fine. Thank you." "She said that earlier," Elijah said, voice steady. "But her breathing's shallow, and her hands are shaking." Amanda straightened. "I think we'll let her decide how she's feeling." "Thank you." And then she moved on. Elijah sat back, jaw clenched, fingers laced together. Ava peeked through the seat again, her eyes wide now. She'd heard the tone in Amanda's voice, like Elijah had done something wrong by caring, like alerting someone to a problem was the real problem. Daniel Whitmore leaned across the aisle. "Honey, maybe you should take your inhaler, just in case." Susan shook her head. "It's just nerves." But Elijah knew better, and in less than 2 minutes, everything would change. Not because he raised his voice, not because he pushed his way into a moment, but because he paid attention, and stayed ready when no one else did. Because sometimes, the difference between a bystander and a lifesaver is who's willing to see what others choose to ignore. And Elijah? He saw everything. The soft chime of the seatbelt sign echoed through the cabin as the aircraft climbed higher into the atmosphere. But for Elijah, the real tension had nothing to do with altitude. It was building slowly, not in the wings of the plane, but in seat 2A beside him, where Susan Whitmore was now gripping the armrest with white knuckles, her breathing turning rapid and shallow. Elijah's eyes, alert but calm, tracked every subtle change in her condition. Her lips were dry, her pupils dilated, and her chest barely lifted with each breath. He glanced toward the aisle, searching for Amanda, but the flight attendant had retreated to the galley, chatting with another crew member near the service cart, oblivious. The passengers in first class remained lost in their screens, headphones, or newspapers, wrapped in their own bubbles of luxury and disconnection. No one was watching Susan. No one but him. Daniel Whitmore, still seated across the aisle, was reading a magazine. When he glanced up and saw his wife hunched forward slightly, he spoke, his voice low with concern. "Sue, you all right?" She lifted her eyes to him, but her answer never came. Instead, she gasped, a high-pitched, involuntary wheeze that startled even herself. Her left hand flew to her chest, her right trembled uncontrollably. Daniel dropped his magazine and stood. "Flight attendant," he barked. "She needs help, now!" The reaction wasn't instant. Amanda emerged from the galley, confused at first, then alarmed by Daniel's volume. "Sir, what's going on?" "She can't breathe," Daniel shouted. "Do something!" Amanda approached briskly, crouched next to Susan, and began fumbling with the overhead call button and intercom. "Captain, we may have a medical emergency in first class. Please prepare to page the cabin." Her tone was official, but her hands were shaking. She didn't have a plan, just protocol. Elijah didn't wait for permission. He had already unbuckled his seatbelt and was crouching beside Susan's seat, opening the side pocket of her tote bag. "She has an inhaler in here," he said. "But it's not working fast enough. She's in bronchospasm." His voice was clear, focused, not panicked. "She needs airway support. I can help until the oxygen tank arrives." Amanda stared at him, blinking. "You need to sit down. Now." "No," Elijah replied simply. "I know what I'm doing." Susan was wheezing louder now, unable to speak. Her head lolled back slightly, and Daniel, now on one knee, was nearly in tears. "What's happening to her? Help her!" Amanda grabbed her radio again. "Captain, I need a doctor. Anyone on board?" The intercom clicked on. "Ladies and gentlemen, if there is a doctor or licensed medical professional on board, please make your way to the front of the cabin." Nothing. No one moved. No one answered. A long, sickening pause stretched over the cabin like fog. Marcus King, the civil rights attorney, stood slowly from row 4A. "I'm not a doctor," he said, "but I think the kid knows what he's doing." He pointed toward Elijah, who was already positioning Susan's seat to recline slightly and tilting her head back to clear her airway. "I've seen enough real emergencies to know that panic is not what saves people. Calm is, and this boy's calm." Amanda hesitated. "Don't just stand there," Daniel yelled. "Let him help her." Amanda handed Elijah the oxygen mask and canister with trembling fingers. "Here, the regulator's on 2 liters. Elijah nodded. He attached the mask to Susan's face gently, his voice low and steady. "Ma'am, I need you to take slow breaths, in through your nose. You're doing great." He squeezed her hand once. She blinked. Barely, but enough to know she was still with them. The mask hissed softly as oxygen flowed. The cabin was silent. Every passenger in first class was watching now. No earbuds, No distractions. Just stunned stillness as a child they had all silently dismissed took control of a life-and-death situation with more grace than many grown men. Amanda stepped back, hands to her mouth. Ava peeked from her seat with tears in her eyes. Captain Cole appeared from the cockpit, brows furrowed. "What's her status?" "She's stabilizing." Elijah said, "Her breathing is still shallow, but she's getting air now. She'll need a hospital as soon as we land. I think she has a history of COPD." The captain looked at Amanda. "Get medics waiting on the tarmac." Then, to Elijah. His voice softened. "Son, what's your name?" "Elijah Thomas." "Sir, you a medical student or something?" "No, sir," Elijah said, glancing briefly at Susan, who was slowly regaining color in her face. "My mom's an ICU nurse. She taught me everything I know." Cole nodded, slowly, respectfully, and for the first time that flight. Amanda didn't look superior. She looked ashamed. The other passengers remained quiet, but something in their eyes had shifted. Gone was the suspicion. Gone was the discomfort. In its place, reverence, humility, regret. Daniel reached over and grasped Elijah's hand. His voice broke. "Thank you, son. I thought I was going to lose her." Elijah nodded. "She's strong. She just needed someone to act fast." Amanda knelt next to Elijah now, a far cry from her earlier tone. You saved her life." Elijah didn't respond right away. He just looked down at Susan, still holding the oxygen mask gently to her face, making sure the fit was snug, that her breaths remained steady. Then, finally, he looked up. "I just did what I was taught," he said quietly, "even if people didn't think I belonged here." The silence that followed wasn't awkward anymore. It was reverent, respectful. No one dared look at him the way they had before, because now they saw him clearly, not as a black boy in the wrong seat, but as the only person in the room who had done the right thing when it mattered most. For a long moment after the crisis had passed, the cabin of Flight 728 remained utterly still. Not still like before. That cold, judgmental silence Elijah had felt when he first sat down. But a different stillness now. This was the silence that follows a moment no one can quite explain. A hush that settles in when people know they've witnessed something bigger than themselves. Susan Whitmore, her breathing now slower and more rhythmic under the oxygen mask, lay reclined in her seat, eyelids fluttering but stable. Her hand, pale and trembling, still held Elijah's. Daniel, seated beside her, was wiping his eyes with a napkin, trying to contain the flood of emotion in his chest. He had just come to the brink of losing his wife, the woman who'd shared his coffee every morning for 43 years, and the only person who had stepped in, who had truly seen her distress, was the child they'd all watched with such quiet suspicion only minutes earlier. Elijah sat upright again, slowly adjusting his seat, breathing evenly, eyes calm but alert. His backpack was still at his feet, slightly unzipped. The corner of his spiral-bound science notebook peeked out, the page he'd opened earlier. Hypoxia and respiratory failure still lay open, its hand-drawn diagrams pencil-shaded with care. Across the aisle, Amanda Pierce stood frozen with her hands clutched at her sides, staring at Elijah like she was trying to reconcile two versions of him in her head. The version she had judged, and the version who had just saved a life in front of her eyes. Captain Cole remained at the front of the cabin, issuing instructions to dispatch and the ground medical team through his headset. But his eyes kept darting back toward 2B. He had flown hundreds of flights, seen weather emergencies and mechanical problems, but rarely did a human moment stop him like this. He glanced at Amanda and said quietly, "Get him whatever he needs." Amanda gave a small, uncertain nod. Meanwhile, a low murmur started to grow among the other first-class passengers. It wasn't loud, it wasn't chaotic, but it carried a weight, the weight of realization, for people like the man in 3C who had whispered earlier. Didn't know they let kids up here. It wasn't just embarrassment now. It was discomfort. The kind that comes from knowing you failed a test of character and a child passed it with honors. A few rows back, a woman softly said, "Bless his heart." Another leaned into her husband and whispered, "He knew what to do. I wouldn't have even known how to check a pulse." In seat 4A. Marcus King stood slowly and took a step into the aisle. His suit jacket hung neatly off his shoulders, and his gaze was steady, thoughtful. He looked around the cabin, letting his eyes land on every passenger who had witnessed what just happened. Then he spoke, his voice calm and clear, not loud, but commanding. "Let's not pretend this didn't just happen," Marcus said, pausing for breath. "Let's not pretend we all saw this boy walk in here and treated him like he belonged." A few passengers dropped their eyes. "We watched him get questioned, insulted, ignored, and not one of us said a word, not when the flight attendant spoke down to him, not when he got skipped over. We just let it happen. And yet," he turned, looking directly at Elijah. "He's the only one who stood up when someone's life was on the line. No hesitation, no fear, just courage." Elijah shifted in his seat slightly, uncomfortable with the attention, but Marcus continued. "He didn't ask for respect. He earned it. He didn't demand a seat. He showed us why he deserved it. So maybe now we should ask ourselves, who really didn't belong here today?" The words hung in the air like something sacred. For a long time, no one spoke. Then a quiet sound broke through. Clapping. It was Ava, the girl seated behind Elijah, her small hands coming together slowly but deliberately. Her mother followed. Then another passenger. And another. Soon. The entire first-class cabin was applauding, not wildly, not performatively, but with genuine, almost reverent energy. It wasn't about spectacle. It was about acknowledgement, about truth. Amanda didn't clap. She stood at the galley, eyes glassy, lips tight. But something in her expression had shifted, no longer indignant or annoyed, but cracked with realization. Elijah's head stayed low. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't soaking in the praise. He simply stared at his hands, the same hands that had just steadied an oxygen mask and held the life of a stranger for a few fragile minutes. He wasn't used to being the center of attention. Not like this. But somewhere in the noise, he heard a voice. Not in the cabin, in his memory. His mother's voice. "The world won't always know what you carry, baby. But you carry it anyway, quietly, strongly." After the clapping faded, Captain Cole stepped forward and crouched beside Elijah's seat. He didn't speak right away, just looked him in the eyes and nodded once, firmly. "Son, that was remarkable," he said. "You kept your head when adults around you didn't. You saved her." "I just did what I was taught," Elijah said softly. "That's all." Cole stood and looked at Amanda. "We'll need to write this up, but not as an incident, as a commendation." Amanda swallowed hard and gave a small nod. Daniel Whitmore stood again, this time leaning across his seat to shake Elijah's hand. His voice trembled. "You gave me back my wife," he said. "That's not something I can ever repay, but I will never forget this. Or you." Susan's hand lifted slightly from under the oxygen mask, her fingers brushing Elijah's wrist. Her lips moved. He leaned in to hear her. "Thank you, sweet boy." Elijah nodded, just once. And for the first time that day, he smiled. It wasn't wide. It wasn't loud. But it was real. Because for the first time on this flight, maybe in his life, he was seen not as a boy who didn't belong, but as someone whose presence had made all the difference. As the plane soared steady through smooth skies, the atmosphere in first class had changed entirely. There was no more tension, no more awkward glances or whispered doubts. Instead, there was something more solemn, like a congregation that had just heard a sermon that reached places inside them they didn't know needed reaching. Elijah remained seated in 2B, silent, steady, his hands back in his lap. His shoulders were still squared, his posture just as upright as when he first boarded. But something in the air around him was different now. It wasn't defensive anymore. It was dignified, respected, recognized. Passengers who had looked through him earlier now couldn't stop glancing over. Not with suspicion, but with something closer to reverence. As if they had seen not just what he did, but what they didn't. And it weighed heavy on them. Susan Whitmore, still reclined with the oxygen mask gently pressed to her face, reached for her husband's hand. Daniel clasped it tightly. Neither said much, but they didn't need to. The entire cabin had heard her gasping minutes ago. They had seen the moment her face drained of color and her chest fought for breath. They had seen her collapse. And they had watched a 12-year-old boy, the same one their flight attendant had embarrassed, act with more calm, precision, and courage than anyone else in the room. And now, here she was, alive, breathing, whispering thanks to the boy everyone had doubted. Amanda, still hovering near the galley, stood pale and uncertain. Her hands were folded tightly, her eyes downcast. She hadn't addressed Elijah directly since his intervention, not even once. But it was clear, painfully clear, that something had shifted inside her. The weight of her own assumptions, her voice, her earlier words, now echoed against her conscience louder than any in-flight announcement. She had told him, moments after he sat down, "You don't belong here." And now she was wrestling with the truth. He had not only belonged, he had become the one person the entire flight had depended on, in seat 4A. Marcus King took a breath and leaned forward, watching Elijah closely. He had stayed standing after his speech, not because he wanted to be dramatic, but because he knew this was a moment that deserved witness. He had seen these kinds of events play out, in courtrooms, in boardrooms, even in schools, where the color of a child's skin was enough to invite scrutiny before ability was ever considered. But rarely had he seen such a profound reversal in real time. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a business card. He didn't offer it right away. He just held it in his hand, watching, studying. Meanwhile, Ava Lopez peeked through the seat gap again, her eyes wide, her expression different now, no longer confused, but filled with admiration. She leaned close to her mother and whispered, "He's really brave, isn't he?" Her mother nodded quietly. "Yes, mija, he is." Back in the cockpit, Captain Cole finished confirming that medical services would be waiting upon arrival in Washington. Then he did something unusual. He clicked on the intercom and cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'll be landing on time in approximately 1 hour and 15 minutes. I've just spoken with dispatch, and paramedics will be waiting at the gate for one of our passengers." A brief pause. "I want to take a moment to acknowledge a young man seated in first class, Elijah Thomas, who stepped up during a critical moment and assisted a fellow passenger in distress. Thanks to his calm thinking and quick action, we avoided a tragedy today." Another pause. "On behalf of myself, my crew, and everyone on board, thank you, Elijah." The cabin erupted into applause once again, louder this time, But Elijah didn't raise his hand or smile wide. He simply gave a polite nod. A small thank you to the people who were just now starting to see what his mother had always known. He wasn't just a kid in the wrong seat. He was a young man with the heart, training, and composure to save a life. Amanda finally stepped forward. Unsure at first, she knelt slightly next to Elijah's row and whispered, "Mr. Thomas, Elijah, I owe you an apology. A real one." Her voice cracked. "I misjudged you. I treated you like you didn't belong. And I was wrong." She swallowed hard. "I'm so sorry." Elijah looked at her. He didn't speak right away. Then he nodded slowly and said, "Thank you." That was all. No drama, no bitterness, just a calm acknowledgement that her words, like hers earlier, were now her responsibility to carry. Marcus took that moment to step forward and offered Elijah the business card. "Elijah, my name's Marcus King. I'm a civil rights attorney based in D.C. I'd be honored to have you speak at one of our youth leadership programs. I think some other kids need to see what courage really looks like." Elijah hesitated, then took the card with a quiet, "Thank you, sir." Amanda returned to the galley, still shaken but changed. Not perfectly, but changed. Susan, now stable and able to speak with the mask removed briefly, turned to Elijah and whispered, "You're one of the finest young men I've ever met. And I used to teach first grade. I met a lot of good boys. But you're rare." Her fingers gripped his again. "You saved me. You really did." Elijah didn't know how to respond to that, so he just gave a small, humble smile. Across the aisle, Daniel, having regained some composure, said, "Son, you ever need a letter of recommendation? For anything, you find me." The flight settled into a quiet rhythm again, but everything was different. Not because Elijah had forced anyone to change, not because he had demanded their attention, but because he had let his actions speak, and they spoke volumes. No one looked at him the same anymore, not as a black kid in the wrong seat, not as a quiet boy with a tattered backpack, but as someone who had done what no one else did when it counted most. And as the cabin lights dimmed and the clouds outside passed by slowly, there was something deeper in that quiet now. It wasn't judgment. It was respect. As Flight 728 began its descent into Washington, D.C., the glow from the cabin lights softened, and the hum of the engines settled into a steady vibration that buzzed through the seats and the hearts of everyone on board. But for the first-class passengers, this wasn't just the end of a flight. It was the end of something heavier, a long-held assumption, a quiet prejudice, a line drawn in the sand that had just been washed away by the calm, firm hands of a 12-year-old boy. Elijah sat quietly in 2B, still upright, still composed, his seatbelt fastened and his eyes staring out the small oval window beside him. The city lights sparkled far below, a glowing web of orange and gold spreading across the night like a promise. Beside him, Susan Whitmore was sitting up now, pale but smiling softly, her hand resting lightly on her husband's. She was alive. She was breathing. And everyone on that plane knew exactly who they had to thank. Captain Cole's voice came back on the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been given priority landing and will be arriving at Gate 17 within the next 10 minutes. Medical personnel will meet us upon arrival, and we ask that all passengers remain seated until the paramedics have assisted our guest in 2A. Another pause, and then his tone shifted. "Thank you all for your cooperation, and once again, a special thank you to young Mr. Elijah Thomas for his outstanding bravery and composure." No one applauded this time, not out of disrespect, but because the moment felt too sacred, too real, to answer with anything loud. It wasn't about clapping anymore. It was about reflecting. Amanda Pierce, the lead flight attendant, stood stiffly near the galley, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She hadn't spoken since her whispered apology to Elijah, and while she still wore the crisp navy uniform that had once made her feel in control, her posture had changed. She looked smaller, humbled. The quiet kind of regret that doesn't demand forgiveness, only the chance to do better next time. She had rehearsed 1,000 versions of what she might say after landing, but none of them felt right. She just knew that nothing she could say would erase the sting of her first words. "You don't belong here." And yet the boy she'd tried to diminish had responded with calm, kindness, and competence. He had done everything she hadn't. Elijah didn't look at her now. He didn't need to. His mind was with his mom. He imagined her standing in their small apartment in Chicago, folding laundry, humming gospel softly under her breath. He pictured the tired smile she gave him when he showed her his perfect science scores. He thought about how she always told him, "You're gonna walk into rooms and change them, son, just by being who you are." He hadn't fully understood that before today. Now he did. The plane touched down with a soft bump, the landing gear kissing the tarmac with practiced precision. The passengers remained quiet, not rushing to unbuckle, not fumbling for their phones. Instead, they waited, watching, listening. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, as the plane came to a stop and the seatbelt light turned off, Amanda took the microphone one last time. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated as medical staff come aboard, and on behalf of our crew, thank you for flying with us." Her voice paused. Then she added something that wasn't in the script. "And thank you, Elijah, for everything." The cabin door opened with a loud click, and 2 paramedics stepped inside, rolling a compact gurney and carrying an oxygen monitor. Susan smiled at them weakly. "I'm okay," she said, voice gravelly. "Just listen to that boy. He saved me." One of the medics, a young woman in her 30s, smiled down at Elijah. "We heard about you," she said warmly. "You kept her stable. That's something a lot of adults can't even do." Elijah nodded politely. Glancing over as Susan was carefully assisted from her seat, Daniel leaned in one last time and whispered, "We'll never forget you. Never." Then, as they were wheeled down the aisle, the passengers silently parted like a sea, a pathway of respect for the woman who had nearly died and the boy who brought her back. Once the paramedics were gone, the cabin came alive with motion. People stood, collected bags, whispered among themselves. But this time, Elijah wasn't ignored. A man with gray hair stopped to shake his hand. A woman from row 1 pressed a note into his palm. Even the man who had once smirked as Elijah boarded, the one in the gray blazer, leaned in and said, "You taught me something today, son." Marcus King, the civil rights attorney, approached and handed him a small card. "This is my direct number. You ever want to come visit the Capitol with my team or speak to some of our youth leaders? You've got a seat anytime. First class. No questions asked." Amanda approached last. She bent slightly, lowering herself to eye level. "I know I said sorry earlier," she began, her voice strained. "But I want you to know, I've been a flight attendant for 12 years, and I've never, not once, seen someone stay as calm and focused as you did today. I hope you keep being exactly who you are, because the world needs that." She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a set of plastic wings, the kind flight attendants used to give children decades ago. She looked down at it, hesitating, then offered it to him. "I don't know if they do this anymore, but I think you earned them." Elijah took the wings with quiet grace. "Thank you, ma'am." He stood, collected his backpack, and stepped into the aisle. Passengers parted again without being asked, not because he demanded it, because he deserved it. As he stepped off the plane and into the jet bridge, the cool air hit his face, and he breathed in deep. Not just oxygen, but something heavier, something stronger. Like he'd shed a layer of what the world thought of him and stepped into who he really was. Outside. Lisa Thomas stood waiting at the terminal window, eyes scanning the crowd, when she saw her son. She didn't notice the passengers watching him. She didn't see the flight crew whispering or the airport staff glancing over. She saw her boy, backpack slung over one shoulder, notebook under his arm, shoulders tall, eyes calm. She opened her arms and he walked straight into them. "You okay, baby?" she asked. Elijah nodded against her shoulder. "Yeah, Mom, I'm good." And for a moment, neither of them said anything else, because they both knew this wasn't just a good flight. It was the beginning of something more. 3 days after the flight, a letter went viral. Not a tweet, not a video, not some clipped headline. A letter. Typed. Printed. Signed in elegant cursive at the bottom by one Mrs. Susan Whitmore. She had written it from her hospital bed in Washington. Just after being discharged with a clean bill of health and a renewed sense of purpose. It was addressed to the airline's corporate office, but by the time it hit the press, it was everywhere, from major news outlets to local church bulletins. The letter began simply, "To whom it may concern, your staff treated a young black boy like he didn't belong in first class. Then he saved my life." The rest of the letter told the story in careful, powerful detail, not just of her near-death experience on board Flight 728, but of the young man beside her who saw what no one else did, who acted with clarity and courage when others froze, who proved that grace and skill come in all forms, even in the body of a soft-spoken 12-year-old in a Navy sweater vest. Elijah never expected any of it. Not the phone calls, not the interview requests, not the framed letter the airline mailed to his house with a handwritten apology from the CEO, not the invitation to speak at the Youth Leadership Forum in D.C., where Marcus King introduced him by saying, "He didn't speak loud, but he made the world listen." And certainly not the applause that filled the auditorium when he walked on stage with his notebook tucked under one arm and a quiet smile that said, "I'm still just me." What mattered most to Elijah wasn't the attention. It was the conversation that followed. At school, kids stopped him in the hallways to say they'd seen the article. Teachers asked him to talk to their classes about courage under pressure. His science teacher had his photo pinned to the board next to a headline that read, "Student becomes unexpected hero at 3,000 feet." But Elijah didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a boy who had done what his mom taught him to do: pay attention, act when needed, and treat people like they matter, even when they don't treat you the same. At home, life returned to normal. Mostly. Lisa Thomas kept her job at the hospital, though now her co-workers jokingly called her the woman who raised the kid who saved a life. She always smiled and said, "I just raised him to be ready. He did the rest." Every evening, she made dinner while Elijah sat at the kitchen table with his notebook open, not for homework, just sketching, dreaming, planning. Sometimes they'd talk about it, sometimes not. But there was a peace in that rhythm, a quiet understanding. One afternoon, a letter arrived in the mail addressed to Elijah. No return name, just a typed envelope with a D.C. postmark. Inside was a note. "Dear Elijah, I was sitting in seat 3C on your flight. I didn't say anything when the flight attendant questioned you. I didn't speak up when others rolled their eyes or whispered. I just sat there, watching. After you saved that woman's life, I couldn't even look you in the eye. I want to thank you. And I want to tell you something. You made me think hard about the kind of man I want to be. I hope my son grows up to be more like you than me." With respect. David R. Elijah folded the letter carefully and placed it in his notebook, beside the business card Marcus had given him, and the set of plastic flight wings Amanda had offered with teary eyes. He didn't share the letter with anyone, not because he was hiding it, but because he understood that growth sometimes begins in private. He also knew what that man had done took humility, and humility, like courage, deserved respect. Later that week, at the Youth Leadership Forum, Elijah stood on a stage in front of 400 students, teachers, and public officials. He wore a simple white button-down, dark slacks, and the same shoes he'd worn on the flight. When the crowd quieted, he stepped up to the mic. He didn't read from a paper. He didn't use slides. He just spoke. People looked at me like I didn't belong, and for a minute, I believed them. But when I saw someone needed help, I didn't think about seats or uniforms or what people thought I was. I thought about what my mom taught me. Be ready. Stay calm. Do good. That's what I did. He paused, then added softly, sometimes. The world will only see what you look like. But what you do, that's what shows them who you are. The applause came again. And this time, Elijah let himself smile. In the weeks that followed, stories like his sparked conversations across schools, churches, and newsrooms. People asked, how many other Elijahs are out there? How many kids are overlooked, underestimated, ignored, until the moment they're needed most? And more importantly, what if we didn't wait for a crisis to see their worth? The airline implemented new training modules for their cabin crew, not just for emergencies, but for recognizing unconscious bias. Amanda Pierce voluntarily stepped away from her position for a time. When she returned, she spoke at crew briefings, telling her story not as a warning, but as a confession. She never named Elijah directly. She didn't have to. Everyone already knew. As for Elijah, he kept being himself, kind, curious, steady. He didn't try to prove anything. He didn't have to. The world had tried to shrink him into a stereotype. Instead, he expanded into something larger, not just a boy in first class, but a symbol of what's possible when preparation meets purpose. When a young person refuses to be small in the face of doubt. His story didn't end when the plane landed. It was just beginning. Because the truth is, Elijah didn't save just one life that day. He awakened something in all of us. A reminder that dignity has no dress code, that courage comes in quiet packages, and that sometimes the smallest hands carry the strongest hearts. Thank you for watching. If this story touched your heart, even just a little, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who still believes in quiet courage. Wherever you are, stay kind, stay ready, and never underestimate the strength of a calm voice. Until next time.